To the east of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, where Her Majesty the Queen has just been laid to rest, is a structure that is now known as the Albert Memorial Chapel and contains a cenotaph to Prince Albert, the wife of Queen Victoria, and the tomb of Prince Leopold, the son of Victoria and Albert, and of Albert Victor, the eldest son of King Edward VII. Below this space is the Royal Vault, where the Duke of Edinburgh's coffin currently lies, and where the Queen will lie temporarily before they are both buried beside her mother and father in the George VI Memorial Chapel. In the vault already lie King George III and Queen Charlotte, King George IV, King William IV and Queen Adelaide, and 20 other members of the royal family. The Albert Memorial Chapel is on the site of a chapel that King Henry VII began to build in the 1490s as his burial place, but abandoned and never finished. Later, it was the site of a Catholic chapel of King James II. By the early 19th century, this space, which had become known then as the Tomb Chamber, was in rack and ruin. In 1800, George III decided to transform the Tomb Chamber into a chapter house for the Order of the Garter and to create the Royal Vault beneath it. The need for a new burial place for the royal family was fairly pressing. The vault, built by his grandfather King George II in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, was more or less full, and George III and Queen Charlotte had a large family. George III began making plans in 1800 to do this work, and he commissioned his favourite architect, James Wyatt, to design the vault, which replicates almost entirely the footprint of the tomb chamber above. Work finally began in 1810, and Wyatt excavated 20 foot of chalk from below the tomb chamber and created for the king a structure that was a far cry from the meagre and dismal burial places of previous British monarchs in Westminster. And we'll do a video on those separately. For example, the vault of his grandfather George II under the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster was low, cramped and utilitarian, whereas this new royal vault at Windsor was architecturally beautiful, and at 70 foot long and 28 foot wide was airy and spacious. The vault was roofed with Gothic stone vaulting of Bath stone supported on Gothic pillars, and burial space was provided on York stone shelving in niches in the wall, which provided space for 64 coffins. At the east end of the vault, there were raised plinths with room for 5 more coffins, and in the centre, low plinths were created intended to support 12 more coffins, those of sovereigns and their consorts. So there was enough space for all of George's large brood of children and for generations of the royal family to come. It has never been filled, though. Currently, only 25 people are buried there. This engraving of 1821 shows the first occupants of the vault. At the east end are the coffins of King George III and Queen Charlotte, flanked by the smaller coffins of their children. Princess Amelia, who died at the age of 27, was the first occupant of the vault. Her 2 brothers, Alfred, who died aged 2, and Octavius, who died aged 4, were originally buried in Westminster Abbey and were only brought to Windsor in 1820. In the side niches are the coffins of George III's sister, Princess Charlotte was the daughter of King George IV, and had she not died in childbirth, she would have been queen. Instead, her cousin Victoria succeeded. Notice the bright colours of the coffins. Most of the royal coffins in this period except those of the sovereign, were covered in crimson velvet with silver and silver gilt fittings. In the second illustration for the 1850s, the vault is somewhat fuller now, and you can see on the centre plinths the coffins of King George IV and King William IV and Queen Adelaide. Notice that all the coffins are topped with little crowns or with coronets. Placing funerary crowns or coronets made of gilt copper on top of coffins was a normal feature of funerals from the Tudor times until the reign of Queen Victoria, when the tradition then died out. Talking of Queen Victoria, she had the vault rearranged in the 1860s or 70s when she had the tomb chamber above transformed into the Albert Memorial Chapel. You can see how things were rearranged in these two fascinating photos taken after the funeral of Edward VII in 1910, which show his coffin lying in the vault on one of the centre plinths. Victoria had all the coffins cleared from the centre of the vault and had them placed in the niches in the wall. These were then enclosed in heavy wrought iron grills with their names upon them. The raised plinths at the east end of the chapel, where George III and Queen Charlotte and their young children had originally been laid, were removed entirely and were substituted with an altar with a cross and candlesticks. Behind is some decoration on the wall, perhaps painted figures of angels. There are two entryways into the royal vault. There is a spiral staircase near the east end of the chapel for those on foot, and a shaft for coffins to travel down. Now, we saw the latter being used last year at the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh, and it will be used again for the funeral of the Queen. The floor of the main chapel is tiled in black and white tiles, and just in front of the high altar of the chapel, they can be lifted to expose the top of the shaft. This shaft contains a mechanised catafalque that lowers the coffins very slowly through the floor. This catafalque takes the coffins down to a small antechamber below it, which is then connected via a long passage to the royal vault itself. Now, you can get something of a glimpse of that passage connecting the vault to the catafalque in this illustration showing the coffin of the Duchess of Teck, Queen Mary's mother, lying in the vault after her funeral. The passage is behind the iron gates and appears to be vaulted in stone like the main vault itself. Now, I don't imagine the vault has much changed since the photos of Edward VII's coffin were taken in 1910. I imagine the centre plinths have been cleared of coffins and all of them placed now in the side walls. My suspicion is that the coffin of the Duke of Edinburgh has been lying on one of those plinths since last April, and that the Queen's coffin will join him there for a few hours at least. Now, before I end, there is another interesting historical anecdote relating to the Royal Vault that I would like to relate to you. In 1813, it was decided that the area at the bottom of the catafalque shaft needed widening so that coffins could be more easily taken into the Royal Vault. And the workmen undertaking this work accidentally broke through to the west as they were doing this into another burial vault. And in that vault, they found 3 coffins. In the presence of the Prince Regent, later George IV, the coffins were investigated. 2 of the coffins were made of solid lead, the outer wooden casing that would have been around the lead having perished, and they were the coffins of King Henry VIII and his favourite wife, Jane Seymour. The most massive of the two, that of Henry, was in the centre of the vault. The third coffin still had the remains of its wooden case around its lead shell and was covered in the remains of a black velvet pall. And this was the coffin of the executed King Charles I. On top was the tiny coffin of a stillborn child of Queen Anne. Now, curiosity got the better of the Prince Regent and the assembled company, and they investigated the contents. They opened the coffins and found the body of Charles I, semi-mummified. Here's a drawing of his head. They also opened the coffins of Henry VIII and Queen Jane, who they found to be skeletal, though parts of Henry VIII's beard were still attached to his skull. Half a vertebra, a tooth, and a portion of King Charles's beard were removed, later to be replaced in 1888. Now, the Prince Regent was a pompous, vain, and foolish man, and was constantly being mocked by the cartoonists and the popular press. And one cartoon lampooned this event of the discovery of this vault. The prince was, of course, estranged from his wife Caroline of Brunswick and was absolutely desperate to divorce her, but he had no grounds to do so. So he is shown as a figure of fun gazing on King Harry, who got rid of many wives while he could not get rid of one. Thanks very much for watching.